All right, I will say good morning, a great schus Baruch Hashem, to be able to begin the new parag of Cheskas Habatim together, and especially auspicious that we are beginning this parag on Basra B'Tammuz, a day in which we commemorate the fact that thousands of years ago the walls of Yerushalayim were breached, the beginning of the Churban, the beginning of destruction, and here, in the midst or in the beginning of destruction, we have Hischachos, we start something new, we start the new parag. And I think this in and of itself is the great eternality and great koach of Klal Yisroel. That even in the midst of destruction and loss, we have the ability to always find renewal. Our renewal today, Baruch Hashem, is a new parak of Cheskas Habatim. We never stop. We never stop. No matter what is happening, no matter what is going on, no matter what the world takes from us, Klal Yisrael keeps moving forward. Cheskas Habatim. This is very interesting. So again, the chazaka, how does one establish a chazaka on a home? Now, remember again, we're talking about a chazaka in this case refers to use over a prolonged amount of time, which essentially establishes ownership. So how do you create a chazaka on a bayis? How do you create a chazaka? And by the way, how beautiful it is. Cheskas Habatim. How do you create a chazaka on a bayis? Today, when we remember again the fact that at the beginning of the process that cost us our Beis HaMikdash, we recognize that there's a Cheskas Habatim, there's a chazaka that we have over our bayis that no one could ever take from us. So Cheskas Habatim, v'haboros, hashichin, v'hama'aros, v'hashochavos, v'hamerchatzos, v'beis habadin, v'beis hashalchin, v'havadin. So again, all of these items, a home, pits, cisterns, caves, dovecotes, bathhouses, olive presses. Beis hashalchin is an irrigated field. Avadim, slaves, anything which produces fruit on a regular basis. Cheskasan shalosh shanim miyom liyom. Chazaka is established by usage for 3 years on a consistent basis. So miyom liyom literally means every day on a consistent basis. So therefore, again, if a person goes ahead and uses any of these items for 3 years, and their usage is uncontested, again, we'll qualify this a little more, but the usage is uncontested, and halacha l'maaseh, they're using it every day for 3 years, these are items that produce peiros, produce fruit, so to speak, results on a regular basis. Therefore, halacha l'maaseh, that creates a presumption, a chazaka of ownership. Incredible. First, let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi is Beis HaShachin mitoch shamayin b'socho. Now, this is interesting. So remember, we're talking over here with an irrigated field. So Beis HaShachin is an irrigated field, which is a field that has a water source inside of it. Shamashkim also mimenu tadir. Therefore, you water the field frequently. Osim peros tadir. So because the field is irrigated, you water it frequently. Therefore, it produces fruit regularly. V'chol davar she'osa peros tadir cheskasan shalosh shanim miyom liyom. And anything ultimately, again, which produces fruit on a regular basis. So it requires 3 years of use, but constant use, consistent use, 3 years every day. So again, understand what chazaka does. Chazaka says like this: I've been using a field for 3 years. Let's talk about an irrigated field, which or any of these items in this first list, which produces peiros on a regular basis. I've been using it for 3 years, and now after 3 years, Reuven comes along and says, "Hey, that's my field." And now I say, "No, it's not. It's my field." So now Reuven says, "Okay, prove it. Prove where's your shtar? Where's your document that says that I sold it to you?" Meaning, let's say we know in the past that Reuven did own this field, and I say, "I don't have a shtar." So the fact that I've been using it uninterrupted for 3 years, right, for 3 years on a consistent basis, miyom liyom, and no one has ever contested my usage, that in and of itself is indicative of ownership. Incredible. Now again, halacha l'maaseh, but if I used it for 3 years, but it wasn't miyom liyom, it wasn't consecutive, then that does not establish presumption of ownership. On the other hand, stei habal. Now again, stei habal is a field that is sustained through rainwater. So cheskasa shalosh shanim yom. Now a stei habal, a non-irrigated field, a rainwater field, a rain field, we'll call it the rain field, only produces fruit once a year. Because it's not constantly watered, therefore it doesn't have constant crops, therefore only produces fruit once a year. Rashi points out over here, so now this is interesting. So now when it comes to a field that is provided for with rainwater, so because it's not producing fruit all of the time, so the chazaka is still going to be 3 years. But you don't need 3 years of constant and consistent use because it's not always producing fruit. I say, how much do you need? This is machlokes. Rabbi Shmuel says, Shlosh chadashim b'rishona, u'shlosha b'achrona, u'shnei masar chodesh b'emtzar shmona asar chodesh. Rabbi Rabbi Shmuel says essentially 18 months. How do you get 18 months? 3 years at the end of year number 1. Right, 3 years, 3 months, right? 3 months in year number 1, 3 months in year number 3, and an entire year number 2. So essentially you have a piece of year 1, which is enough to produce a crop, a piece of year 3, which is enough to produce a crop, but year 2, you need an entire year. That's you establish chazaka on a field that is provided for with rainwater. Rabbi Akiva says, Chodesh barishona, the Chodesh bachrona, u'shnei masar Chodesh be'emtza, hare arba arabasa. Rabbi Akiva argues, he holds. Now again, so Rabbi Akiva holds you only need 1 month in year 1 and 1 month in year 3, but an entire year 2. Now, what Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva are both agreeing about is that halacha l'maisa, you do not need a complete 3 years for a rainwater field. Since that field is not producing fruit continuously and constantly, therefore you do not need 3 complete years. But you need 3 years. It just doesn't have to be constant. Herein lies the machlokes as to how much of the 3 years you need. Essentially, Rabbi Shmuel is saying you need 18 months, 3 months year 1, complete year 2, and 3 months year 3. Rabbi Akiva is saying 14 months, you need 1 month year 1, 1 month year 3, complete year 2, gives you 14 months. Again, we'll get into the Gemara more as to what exactly the machlokes is over here. And again, we'll see, fine, we'll just do the Mishnah for now. I'm Rabbi Shmuel Silber, when is this so? In other words, when is what so? When is it so that halacha l'maisa, right, that you need 18 months, according to Rabbi Shmuel, for a field for chazaka? So the Gemara says, b'stei lavan. This is talking about a grain field. Rashi points out over b'stei lavan, shekal perasin niklotim meparak echad lefichach tzarich shalosh shanim. So again, in a wheat field, and especially if you have a field that is watered by or provided for by rainwater, it's going to produce 3 crops, and this is the amount of time that you would need for those 3 crops. However, aval b'stei ilan, but let's say you have an orchard. Kanas, and by the way, stei ilan could also mean, Rashi says, sheperosea niklatin leprakim anavim perak echad v'zeisim perak echad uteina beperak acher. So let's say you have a different field, and in this field again, this field has multiple different items. So you have, for example, grapes, and you have olives, and you have figs. Now you can have all of these items growing within the same field, obviously distanced from one another, but still in the same field. But halacha l'maisa, they would go ahead and they would have 3 different harvest times. So this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Shmuel says like this: Kanas es tvuasa, umasak es zeisav, kanas es keitzo, hare elu shalosh shanim. So this is very interesting. So Rabbi Shmuel would say like this: the din of 3 years is not simply a din in time, but rather it's a din in harvests. So the assumption is that, again, you need 3 years in order to get 3 harvests. Rabbi Shmuel says, however, let's say you have a field that is producing multiple crops. Each of those types of crops have a different harvest. So within 1 year, maybe you get 3 different crops. So ultimately, Rabbi Shmuel will say that will count as 3 years. Okay, so this requires further iyun, further explanation, as we will see later on in the Gemara. Okay, fine. So first of all, also, if you look at Rashi points out, and Rashi, I gloss over, but we should really go back to it just a moment, because Rashi explains the machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. So Rashi says, Rabbi Sabal, ha-mistapekes ha-megishamim, eino osa peros ele pam achaz b'shana, cheskasa shalosh shana vein tzrichon liyom liyom. Umay cheskasa. So remember again, in a field that is provided for by rainwater, it only produces a crop once a year. Therefore, you need 3 years, but you don't need necessarily consistency throughout the entire 3 years. So how much? How do you establish chazaka? So Rashi points out, Rabbi Shmuel Omer Shalosh Chadashim Achronim Shal Shana Rishona, Ushlosh Chadashim Mishorim Shal Shana Achrona, V'emtsois Shlema. So Rabbi Shmuel says, remember, I need the last 3 months of year 1, first 3 months of year 3, and complete year 2. Now, what's the logic? Sheish memarim lizra lefnei Rosh Hashanah, v'chevan she'echzik basof shana rishona shlosh chadashim, v'yesh lo edim shezarin ba'osan shalosh chadashim, v'chein b'shlosh chadashim mishorim shalachrona, harezu chazkas shalosh sufos. Okay, so again, we'll get into all of the Gemara. We're just going to see the machlokes Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel is not just like arbitrary. It actually has to do with how people plant their fields. But again, so here's the point to remember. We can essentially break up the Mishnah into different parts. Part 1 of the Mishnah tells me that halacha l'maisa, anything which produces produce, or what we call peiros, right, results on a regular basis, Chazaka is established over 3 years, and you have to be using it every day over those 3 years. So constant and consistent use. Right? What about the steabal? What about a field that is provided for through rainwater? Machlokes. Rabbi Shmuel, 18 months. Rabbi Akiva, 14 months. Rabbi Shmuel then came along and said this whole idea of multiple years to establish chazaka is only a din in a wheat field. But let's say you have a field that has multiple items planted with different harvest seasons. Technically speaking, if you do 3 distinct harvests in 1 year, that could also potentially count as a chazaka. Incredible. Says the Gemara. I'm Rabbi Yochanan. Shematni al Usha. I heard from the Holchei Usha. Literally again from the people who went to Usha. Now both say, what's the Holchei Usha? Rashi says, Holchei Usha. Shegalsa Sanhedrin leUsha Kidarim Rosh Hashanah. Eser Golios Galsa Sanhedrin. Shabbos says, remember again, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the Beis HaMikdash compound, right, in recognition of the upcoming destruction. The Sanhedrin relocated, and one of the places that the Sanhedrin relocated was to Shabbos. I just want to point out again, how incredible is it that we are doing this Gemara of relocation of the Sanhedrin? How incredible is it that we're doing this Gemara, ultimately, again, Sanhedrin preparing for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash on Shiv Aser B'Tammuz. Incredible. So Rabbi Yochanan said, I heard from the Holchei Usha Shem, they used to say, Minayin lechazaka shalosh shanim. So Rabbi says it's interesting because the Mishnah presupposes this idea of chazaka being established over 3 years. So the Gemara just says, by the way, where does that concept come from? That chazaka is 3 years, right? From where do we know that? From where is that known? So the Gemara says, Mishar Hamuad. This is incredible. We learn it out from Shar Hamuad. Now remember, again, what's back to our Bava Kam days? Shar Hamuad means an ox that is warned that it's to gore. In other words, a shar starts out as a tam. Every shar starts out as a tam, right? We give every shar the benefit of the doubt. So it starts as a regular shar. Once it gores 3 times, it becomes a muad, right? As a muad, remember again, if it goes ahead and it gores, it has to pay nezek shalim, complete damages. As a tam, only chatzi nezek. So we learn out the concept of chazaka from a muad. Just like a shar becomes a muad after 3 times, so to chazaka, establishment of ownership, is done only after uncontested use for 3 years. So Mashar Hamuad Kevan Shenagach Shalosh Negichos Nafak Lemichezkas Lamikal Lechezkas Muad, just like a shar, if it gored 3 times, it leaves the status of a tam and it becomes a muad. Hachanami Kevan Da'achla Tlas Shanim Nafik Le Mirshus Mocher Vekaima Le Birshus Lokeach. So too over here, once I use the field for 3 years, ultimately, again, in an uncontested fashion, it leaves the domain of Ruvain and becomes mine. Now, understand, as I mentioned before in the Mishnah, this whole discussion of chazaka really works in the following situation where we know the field at one point in time was owned by Ruvain, but now I've been using it for 3 years and no one has contested my usage. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, just like a shar leaves one status and goes to another status after 3 gorings, it leaves the status of a tam, becomes a muad after 3 gorings. So too, again, the status of the field could also change. I used it, right before it was known as Ruvain's. I used it now for 3 years uncontested. It becomes mine. If that's the case, imashra muad ad negich revius lo mechay v'hachanami ad shana revius lo kaime bershusei. The Gemara said, 1 second. If that's the case, we should say as follows: just as a shar hamuad, right? Just as a shar hamuad, he's really only a muad by the 4th goring. In other words, he becomes a muad after 3 gorings, but he only really is only like we only act on that status by the 4th goring. Hachanami at shana revius lo kaim bershusei. So we should say over here, the field really doesn't become mine until year number 4. To which the Gemara says, Hachi hashta hasam nichi nagach shalach megichos havimuad. Now understand what happened. After a shor gores 3 times, the shor itself becomes a muad, right? The status changes. We'll say amid beis v'idach kilo nagach ma'ile shalim. Okay, so by a shor it's different because I understand the status changes. The status fundamentally changes after goring number 3. But again, but lamaisa, what we'll call it is the financial ramifications of that obviously aren't going to come up until the shar gores a 4th time. So, but here, after I use it, if you use the field uncontested after 3 years, it becomes mine. What the Gemara is essentially saying is like this. In other words, obviously, it is a difference. What we're looking at is by shar hamuad, after 3 gorings, the status of the shore changes. It's true the ramifications of that change in status don't really come up, don't present themselves until it gores a fourth time. That is true, but the change in status happens after 3 gorings. So too, the use of the property after I've used it for 3 years, the change in status occurs. Incredible. If that's the case, that I'm learning out. So now we've established from what we call from Holchei Usha, from the members of the Sanhedrin who went to Usha, is that the concept of Chazaka being established after 3 years is learned out from Shar Hamuad. If that's the case, Chazaka Sheni Matayna Tehevi Chazaka. So we'll say if that's the case, then even a Chazaka does not go ahead and have an accompanying claim. Now what does this mean? What does this mean? Look at Rashi. We'll see this in a couple of days from now. We'll see this a couple of days from now. The Gemara says, so let's play out the following case. I'm using a field. Reuven comes over to me. Reuven says, what are you doing in my field? Now, ultimately, again, if I say, you sold it to me, that's called the taina. Right, I'm making a counter. What am I doing in a field? You sold it to me. And then again, of course, Reuven is going to say, where's the shtar? I'm going to say, I don't have the shtar, but I've been using it for 3 years uncontested. What if Reuven comes over to me and he says, what are you doing in my field? And I say to Reuven, no one ever said anything to me. Now, so I am not responding with a formal taina of my own, right? I'm not responding with a formal claim. So the Gemara says, if we're learning out Chazaka from Shara Muad, then now we're going to see, by the way, that if I don't respond with a claim, then Chazaka doesn't work. Chazaka only works when I respond with a claim that says, you sold it to me, and I used it for the last 3 years, and no one contested it. There needs to be a claim. So the Gemara says, but if you're learning out from Shur Hamuad al Me'ata, Chazaka sheni matane teve Chazaka. But if that's the case, we'll say by Shur Hamuad, right? By Shur Hamuad, even if there is no claim, ultimately the status changes. So too over here, we should say that even without a claim, right? So even when Reuven comes and says, hey, you're in my field, and even if I just say, hey, no one has ever said anything to me, that should still be enough to establish Chazaka. Why do we learn? Kol chazaka sheni matayna eine chazaka. Yeah, but we learn that that's not the halacha. That the halacha, in fact, is, like we just said before, that if I'm using the field for 3 years and Reuven comes along and says, what are you doing in my field? And I don't make a taina. I don't say, well, you sold it to me. Instead, I just say, oh, no one ever said anything to me. Then that chazaka is not effective. But if you're learning out from muad, then as long as I have the chazaka, even without a taina, the chazaka should be good. To which the Gemara says, no. Ta'aminan dilma kidaka amar hashta ihu lo toin. So we'll say, here's the problem with that. The problem is if Reuven comes along and says, what are you doing in my field? So Reuven is saying, I still own it. So essentially, the halacha says like this: if I'm going to claim, no, you sold it to me, and now I have that claim coupled with the chazaka, then halacha says, oh, that's meaningful. But if I'm not making a claim, why should the halacha make a claim on my behalf that I'm not making for myself? Then maybe it really is Reuven's field. That's the problem with that situation. So just by the way, it's also interesting, we're picking up a number of nuggets along the way. So we've established now that chazaka is over 3 years. How those 3 years are calculated depends on the item. Sounds like right now we're learning it out from Shar Hamuad. We also know that chazaka by itself is not enough. There has to be a taina. The taina means that when confronted by Reuven, what are you doing in my field? I claim, Reuven, you sold it to me. So that's number one, there's a taina, and then the taina is accompanied by the chazaka, or the chazaka is accompanied by the taina. Without a taina, if I just say, oh, I'm so sorry, no one ever told me it was yours, then lemaisa, my chazaka is meaningless. So the Gemara says it solves maskil Ravira. So Ravira is another kasha. El me'ata, macha shlo b'fanav tavi mecha. So we'll say, so if that's the case, an objection, right? Let's say Reuven objects to my use of the field, not in my presence. This should work. This should work. Why? Because again, we're learning out chazaka from Sharmuad. Mas Sharmuad b'fanav ba'inon avhach enami. I'm sorry. Machashal b'fanav should not work. Right? If Reuven objects to my usage, not in my presence, right? Such an objection should not be halachically valid. Why? It's just like Shar Hamuad. Why? What happens by Shar Hamuad? Ma Shar Hamuad b'fanav ba'inon avhach nami b'fanav ba'inon. This is actually very interesting. By Shar Hamuad, so apparently you could only make a shar into a muad if you make the claim that the ox scored in the presence of the ox's owner. But if you make the claim not in the presence of the ox's owner, then the shar cannot become a muad. So we should say the same thing over here, that halacha l'maisa, Halacha l'maisa, if Reuven claims that Silber is living in my field, but he does not make that claim in my presence, it should not work. It should not work. To which the Gemara says, no, it's different. Hasam v'huad bivalav ksiv hacha chavra islay v'chavrach dechavra islay. To which the Gemara says, by muad there's exeris hakasif. Right? The pasuk says v'huad bivalav, that if you're going to go out and make the aks a muad, you have to make it a muad ultimately again in the presence of the owner. Our case over here is different, right? Why is it's so beautiful? Why is our case different? Because if I'm living in Reuven's field, right, and now Reuven comes along and says, hey, that's my field. Even if Reuven doesn't say it in front of me, but rather what? He goes ahead and he says it in front of someone. That person has a friend, and that person's friend has a friend, and the friend has a friend. And what happens? Ultimately, the word of the objection will reach me. If Reuven doesn't say it in front of me, it'll reach me. But by you can say the same thing by the ox. Right? If I accuse Reuven's ox of being a gorer, it'll reach him also. It's true. That's why the Gemara says by muad there's a pasuk. V'huad b'alav, the warning has to be delivered in front of the owner of the ox. In front of the owner of the ox. But halacha l'maisa again, over here, since there's no such pasuk by chazaka, so therefore we rely ultimately on people communicating with each other. And they'll say, but what a beautiful Gemara. Listen to that. Chavra islay, your friend has a friend. The chavra islay, and the friend of your friend also has a friend. And they'll say, what's the takeaway message? Chaverim kol Yisroel. Right, Klal Yisroel is one big kehila of chaverim. Klal Yisroel is one big mishpacha of chaverim, one big mishpacha of friends. And again, how incredible it is to learn this Gemara on Basra B'Tammuz, on the first day of the 3 weeks, when our entire avoda of these days is Eretz Hashem, to work on our avas chinam, to work on our love for one another, to work on our achdus, to work on really feeling, not just saying chaverim kol Yisroel, but really believing and really feeling Chavirim Kol Yisrael. And again, the Gemara tells us, it's not just like a nice sentiment, it's true. Chavrach de Chavra Islay. The Chavrach de Chavra Islay. Everyone is connected. All of Klal Yisrael is connected. Incredible. Okay. Rabbi Meir, the Amarichik Nigichos of Chayiv, according to Rabbi Meir, who says that by a Shar Muad, right, even if the 3 acts of goring were separated by time, this is called Richek Nigichosav, right? Ultimately, again, if the acts of goring were separated, then you're chayiv. The Gemara says, kirev negichosav lo kol shechein. So remember again, Rameir holds that all the more. So let's say the ox gored 3 times in one day. 3 times in one day, right? Ultimately, Rameir says that makes the ox into a muad. So if that's the case, the Gemara says, achla. So now again, remember, we're learning at chazaka from muad. So if that's the case, just like if the ox gored 3 times in one day, look at Rashi by from Meir Damar, Kolomar Rabbi Huda or Bava Kama, Ezumu Koshi Idu Bo Shloshi Yamim, Ikalamemer Hacha Shlosha Shan doing the Shloshi Yamim. Rabbi Meir Damar Tafilu Naga Shlosha Pamim Biyom Echad. So this is a machlokas, right? Rabbi Huda says you need 3 gorings 3 days. So one can make the argument that what a day is by a muad, a year is by chazaka. So 3 days by a muad, 3 years by chazaka. But Rabbi Meir says, even if the animal gored 3 times in one day, that's enough to make it a muad. So to Rabbi Meir would potentially say that harvesting 3 peiros, right, 3 crops in one day should be enough to establish chazaka as well. Now, what does it mean by like figs? So Rashi points out over here that what's unique about figs is that figs, you could have 1 fig crop, but at the end of the day, it matures at different levels, matures at different or different paces. So you could have part of it that's ripe in the morning, part of it that's ripe in the afternoon, and part of it that's ripe in the evening. So essentially, you could have quote unquote 3 different harvests in one day. Well, according to Rabbi Meir, the same way that an animal could become a muad with 3 gorings in one day, you should be able to harvest 3 crops, so to speak, in one day. To which the Gemara says, right? Let's say you harvest, right? 3 fig harvests in one day, which could happen because the figs mature at different stages. So the Gemara says, no, it won't work. I'll tell you why. Just like by a shar muad, at the time that it does this goring, the next goring is not in existence. In other words, the gorings themselves are separate and independent. When it does the first goring, so to speak, the second goring doesn't yet exist. Hachanami be'idna da isa lahai pera leisa lahai pera. The way it works by chazaka is the three harvests have to be fundamentally independent of another. What does that mean? That literally, again, harvest number 2 doesn't exist at the time that you're doing harvest number 1, and harvest number 3 doesn't exist at the time you're doing harvest number 2. But over here, in the case of the Te'enim, again, all the figs are there. Just all right, some are ready to be picked in the morning, some are ready to be picked in the afternoon, some are ready to be picked in the evening, but they all exist. Okay, the Gemara says, fine, so let me give you a different case. Achla tlasa per b'tlasa yomi. What about harvesting or consuming 3 different crops of fruit in 3 days? So now, okay, I got it. So you can't do 3 times in 1 day. What about 3 days? Kigon, slaf. Well, this is back to our brachas, they say. If you remember, again, the caper bush has many different consumable parts of it that literally mature at fundamentally different times. So meaning, unlike the figs, where within the same day, again, this one's a little bit more ripe, a little less ripe, and the stuff in the caper bush. So again, there are different parts that mature literally on different days. So on day 1, part of it is mature, another part is not mature. So you could have 3 harvests, so to speak, in 3 days of 3 independent things. So let that be a chazaka. Hasam peira miha isa. While it's true that by the tzlaf, it could very well be that some of it is not harvestable on day 1 or on day 2, but Lamais, it's still there. It's not, in other words, the whole chap of chazaka is that at the time that you have the first stage of chazaka, the second stage is not yet present, just like by gorings. It's not yet there, it doesn't yet exist. In these other cases, by produce, so, for example, by the caper bush, even though on day 1 you can't harvest certain things because they're not yet ready, but they exist. So, because they exist, they can't be counted ultimately as 3 independent harvests. Incredible. To which the Gemara says, let's go weiter. So the Gemara says, fine. Right. So I'm sorry. Hasan peremiya isay. In the caper bush, all of the different parts of the fruits, right? All the different fruits are there. They're all present. They're just not yet ripe. They're not yet ripe. In other words, really not ripe at all. But by the next day, they'll be ripe, but they exist. So remember again, I will say, what's turning out over here is, if you're learning out chazaka from Shor HaMuad, just like by Shor HaMuad, halacha l'maisa, excuse me, halacha l'maisa, the gorings are separate and independent, meaning at the time of goring number 1, goring 2 and goring 3 don't exist. You apply that same model to harvesting. At the time of harvesting number 1, harvest number 2 and harvest 3 can't exist. Okay, the Gemara goes weiter. Achla tlas, so let me give a different case. Achla tlas peri b'tlasin yome kigon aspasta. What about 3 crops in 30 days? Like aspasta. Rashi says over here, aspasta, first wide line, min zerahu lasos le'isa behemos. So type of plant that was used for animal feed. Ulesof shloshim yom hu nigmar, va'oskin oso, va'okrin oso, v'zorin achar bimkomo, ubeso shloshim yom gozes in osho shalosh pamim. So interestingly enough, within 30 days, you could actually go ahead and cut back the plant 3 times and harvest it essentially 3 times. So why can't you make that into a chazaka of 3 times in 30 days? To which the Gemara says, hey chidami, what would the case be? So the Gemara says, the kadiach va'achla, the kadiach va'achla. What's the case? The case ultimately, again, is where you cut it back, you eat it. You cut it back, and you eat it. Right. So Rashi says, right. Shegadla ktsas, gavaz va'ochal, gadla od ktsas, v'shuv achal v'gaz. So I'll say, so the idea over here is, so again, the aspasta, so it's growing, I harvest, I cut it back, I take, that's harvest 1, grows more, I cut it back, that's harvest 2, it grows more, I cut it back, that's harvest 3. And I can do that 3 times, I can do that 3 times, ultimately again, within 30 days. Within 30 days. So the Gemara says, Dikadiach va'achla, Hasam mishmatu dikashamit va'achel. To which the Gemara says, Rashi says over here, mishamitu dikashamit va'achel ve'ein ze'achilas kala pri. So interestingly enough, in that case, really what I'm doing is, I'm just harvesting it prematurely. In other words, as opposed to going ahead and let's say having it halacha l'maisa, having it grow fully. What I'm doing over here is I'm cutting it back prematurely. So the Gemara says, in other words, the way you would only leave aspasta is you would let aspasta grow for 30 days, and then you would harvest it whole. What you're doing over here is you're not really harvesting three independent things. What you're doing is you're letting it grow a little, cut it. Letting it grow more, cut it again. Letting it grow a third time, cutting it again. But that's not called three harvests. That's just going ahead and prematurely taking that which is really all considered to be one harvest. Very interesting. The Gemara says, what about achla tlasa peri betlasa yarchi? Fine. So let's go ahead and eat 3 harvests in 30 days. So for example, right? So now let's go ahead. So could go on aspasta lehave chazaka. So the Gemara says, so fine. So now that I know that aspasta does grow fully in 30 days, so fine. Let me come up with a simple case. I could do chazaka in 90 days instead of 3 years. 3 crops of aspasta. Aspasta grows in 30 days, so let me just use that. To which the Gemara says, no. Man hoche usha. So we'll say, let's go back for just a second. Remember again, how did this entire conversation start? This entire conversation started by the hoche usha, right? The hoche usha said, from where do we learn out the concept of chazaka? So the hoche usha said, excuse me. The hoche usha said, we learn it out ultimately again from Shar Hamuad. So the Gemara says, by the way, who is the Hoche Usha? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel. So ultimately, again, it's Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel, Hachenami, Distan Rabbi Shmuel, Omer Medar, Morim B'stei Alavan, Ava B'stei Ilan, Kanas es Tivuaso, Umasak Ezesa, V'kanaf es Ketza, Hare Elu Shalosh Shanim. Shabbos said, the Gemara says, Inochinami, you're right. You're right, by the way. That could work. Because who are the Hoche Usha that we're referencing over here? This is very interesting. Who are the Hoche Usha? The Hoche Usha, in fact, is Rabbi Shmuel. Now remember again, what did Rabbi Shmuel say in the Mishnah? Rabbi Shmuel said in the Mishnah that the only time you need 3 years for chazaka is in a grain field, right? And specifically, again, a grain field, because a grain field is only producing 1 crop a year. So that's when you need 3 years. But Rabbi Shmuel himself said in the Mishnah that if you have a field that produces multiple crops in a year, and you could get in 3 harvests in 3 independent, distinct harvests in 1 year, einachinami, that absolutely could work. That absolutely could work. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, Einachinam, you're right. That's Rabbi Shmuel. So again, therefore, both say, if we bring this full circle, what comes out is as follows. Full circle is, Hoche Usha said, where do we learn out 3 years of chazaka from? We learn out 3 years of chazaka from Shar HaMuad. Just like a shar changes status after goring 3 times, so to, again, uncontested use of a field for 3 years, again, makes me the new owner. The usage makes me the new owner. Now, of course, we've also established halacha l'maisa requires a taina. I have to make a definitive claim that, in fact, it is mine as well. But what does come out over here is that einachinami, it's not really about time, but it's about harvests. It's about harvest. So, for example, if I were to have a field and I harvested 3 aspasta harvests in 90 days uncontested, einachinami, I could claim ownership over that field. So that that closes this first part of the sugya. Again, understand that Hoche Usha, in fact, represents the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, and therefore you could establish chazaka even in less than 3 years. Really what you need is 3 independent, full, complete, independent, independent harvests. But Allah Chalamayis, again, this entire idea is this entire Yisod, or this entire Gemara is working under the premise that the concept of chazaka as we know it is ultimately, again, comes from Shar HaMuad. So was communicated to us by Hoche Usha, who now turns out to be Rabbi Shmuel. Both saying, we'll stop over here for today. Such an incredible chasson with all of you.